Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take a stack of truly dense philosophical texts and really extract the surprising, the crucial nuggets that might just redefine how you think about your own existence.
Today, we are strapping in for what is, it's perhaps the most fundamental challenge to modern Western thought. We're looking at Maurice Merleau-Ponty's devastating critique of René Descartes' Cogito.
That famous line, I think, therefore I am.
The very same one.
And we're working with some rigorous excerpts from Merleau-Ponty's masterwork, Phenomenology of Perception. This isn't just theory, right? This is a deep dive designed to provide a philosophical reconstruction of the self.
Exactly. It's about placing the self back into the body and, crucially, back into time.
So the big question that's kind of hanging over all our source material today is, what happens to the certainty of I think when we recognize that thinking isn't this timeless internal affair?
Right. What happens when you realize it's an act performed by a body that, breathes and perceives and just exists in a messy, finite world?
Okay, so let's start at the top. If we had to boil down Merleau-Ponty's ultimate central claim into a single sentence, the executive thesis, what would that be?
The true nature of the cogito is not timeless, absolute self-possession by a constituting mind, but rather a temporal, actively transcending involvement with the world, a continuous ekstase where consciousness and existence are, well, they're fundamentally inseparable.
Okay, whoa, that is dense. Can you put that in terms of everyday experience? What does that mean for me or for you listening right now?
It means that you don't discover you exist by sitting in a chair and downing everything around you, isolating your mind. You discover you exist in the act of reaching for a coffee cup, or hearing our voices, or planning what you're going to do next.
So my certainty isn't a retreat inward.
Not at all. It's a thrust outward.
That's a massive shift. So what's the philosophical problem that this text is trying to cure?
Well, it's tackling the historical baggage of traditional idealism. This is primarily rooted in Descartes and Kant, and then interpreted by thinkers like Ray, who was part of the tradition Merleau-Ponty was really battling.
And that tradition elevates the mind, the cogito, to what? An eternal, universal constructor of reality.
Precisely. A kind of detached intellectual God that, builds the world from scratch.
And in doing so, what gets lost?
You lose the actual subject, the subject that is born, that gets sick, that is finite, that is fundamentally situated in a particular moment in time and space. Merleau-Ponty wants to reground the subject in that lived, temporal, bodily, and situated reality.
In the concrete reality of being human.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start where Descartes started, which is looking for absolute certainty.
Sounds like a plan.
So Merleau-Ponty starts by describing our most common state of being, which is, and I love this phrase, life thrown headlong into transcendent things. Think about it when you're completely absorbed in something.
Like driving a car, or you're lost in a novel, or watching a movie.
In those moments, your consciousness it's constantly passing wholly outside of you. It takes flight into objects, the plot of the movie, the traffic light ahead, the words on the page.
And in that deep absorption, you are, paradoxically, unaware of yourself. You're only aware of the thing you're engaged with.
And this absorption is what classical realism tries to explain by saying, well, the world, the trees, the laws of physics, they just exist in itself, completely outside of and independent of you, the observer.
But then the Cartesian tradition comes in and argues there must be a final truth, which is the return of things to the self. It says that if you experience a tree, that experience has to be something you can ultimately justify and account for internally.
So if the tree is outside, the experience of the tree must be born and discovered within myself.
Exactly. And this is right where Merleau-Ponty introduces the paradox of the blind assertion.
Okay, explain that.
When I just assert the bare existence of a thing, I look up and say, there is a tree. What meaning can that assertion possibly hold if I am, in his words, ignorant of what they are?
I see. So you can't just know the factual existence of the tree simply because it's out there. That bare assertion is blind.
It's totally blind. If the assertion is true, it implies that the actual unreflective contact with the thing that ekstays into an individual thing already contains a primordial knowledge that's awakened by the contact itself.
So my ability to perceive reality must mean that my perception is already implicitly aimed at something intelligible, something I have the capacity to grasp.
Precisely. If not, how do two mere sensations, say, visual data and auditory data, come together to signify a single cohesive object in space unless your thought is already organized toward an intelligible purpose?
The mind can't just suddenly create meaning from raw atomic sensations that it hasn't itself constituted as a sign.
It can't. And this is what forces the idealist move.
Which is the second picture of knowledge.
Right.
The subject has to swing the other way and actively construct or constitute the world. If the world doesn't just give me the meaning, then I must put into things what I subsequently find in them.
Yes, and this leads directly to the idea of self-consciousness as causa sui, the cause of itself. It's kind of intellectual closed loop.
How so?
If I'm thinking of the world, that thought has to simultaneously be consciousness of my own thought.
Yeah.
If it isn't, the whole act of thinking just dissolves into a series of random events.
And this self-consciousness has to be timeless, a spiritual act of eternity. It has to embrace and anticipate all temporal developments in a single comprehensive intention. This is the hallmark of that idealist cogito.
But this idea of eternity is the critical point of failure, because if the cogito reveals me as the universal constituent of all being, and my mind is a transcendental field with no hidden corners and no outside,
Then my mind is necessarily unique and universal. It has to embrace the totality of reality. This is where philosophers like Kant and Lacusre were led, right?
Exactly.
The absolute subject has to resemble God.
Exactly. And that creates a huge problem.
Which is, wait, if I am this absolute perfect universal constructor, I have no limits. But if I have no limits, where do you come from? Where do other people fit into this picture?
Logically, they don't. Merleau-Ponty argues that, and this is a direct quote, the plurality of consciousness is impossible if I have an absolute consciousness of myself.
So if the only experience of the subject is the one I gain by completely coinciding with it, if my consciousness is, by definition, inaccessible to an outside spectator, then my cogito has to be unique.
You're alone. You can never find anything outside yourself that you haven't already constructed.
So the quest for absolute certainty ironically results in absolute isolation, solipsism. If I'm a perfect transparent to myself, I have no opening, no aspiration towards another because I already contain the totality of being.
The irony is just so rich. The same precise reasoning that leads from a simple event to the absolute, I think, also necessitates the reduction of a multiplicity of I's to one single, soul-constituting consciousness.
Which is a philosophical dead end.
A total non-starter. And this forces Merleau-Ponty to find a way to keep the certainty of the self without resorting to this paralyzing, timeless universality.
And he finds this middle ground by destroying the boundary between the internal thought and the external thing, specifically when we talk about perception.
Yes. Traditionally, Descartes says, I can doubt the thing, the ashtray out there on the table, but I cannot doubt my thought about seeing the ashtray.
But Merleau-Ponty calls this distinction untenable.
He argues that the central insight of phenomenology is that perception is an act in which the act itself is inseparable from the end it's directed toward the thing.
The indissoluble link. To see red is to see red actively existing in the world. If I see an ashtray in the full sense of the word see, I can't just forego the assertion that there is an ashtray there.
Exactly. If the thing is doubtful, the perception is doubtful. If I start to feel doubts about the external presence of the object, that doubt immediately attaches to the vision itself. The certainty of my perceptual existence cannot be logically dissociated from the certainty of its external counterpart.
So the whole Cartesian doubt thing fails right out of the gate. You can't separate the thought of seeing from the thing seen.
Which leads us to a crucial choice. Either I have no certainty of the transcendent thing, in which case my thought of seeing is also uncertain, as the thought implies the thing.
Or I grasp my thought with certainty, which then requires the simultaneous assumption of the genuine existence toward which it's projected. The distinction Descartes tried to make just dissolves.
It completely dissolves.
So the core certainty of the self, the cogito, is achieved only in that simultaneous contact with one's own being and the world's being. What kind of consciousness is this, then?
Consciousness is transcendence through and through. It's not a passive reception of external input that would stop consciousness. It is active transcendence. It is e-stasis. The certainty of the self is the recognition of this deep-seated momentum of transcendence, which is my very being.
So the self is not a mirror, it's a dynamic, outgoing act.
Yes. We have to replace the abstract intellectual self with the self that is defined by action. This means moving away from psychological immanence, private inaccessible states, and transcendental immanence, a universal constituting mind, to a subject defined by this continuous action, this being outside oneself in the world.
We've established that absolute internal certainty is impossible because the self is always oriented outward. But now, let's turn inward again, because we still have that common assumption. If I feel something, I must be certain of it. If I feel joy, I am joyful.
Right, and Merleau-Ponty critiques this idea that everything is truth within consciousness.
He does this by showing that even in our inner life, we distinguish between what we see as true feelings and false or illusory feelings.
And this distinction is crucial because it's not based on some external fact. It's based on how deeply the feeling involves us.
The example of illusory love from the source material is great for this. I might feel willingly united to the loved one, and for a while, my life feels totally committed.
But then later, when the disillusionment happens, you look back and you realize you loved only a particular set of qualities, a useful smile, a mannerism, and not the individual person's total manner of being.
And crucially, you realize you weren't wholly in thrall. You kept corners of your life set aside for other things.
Exactly. So the mistake wasn't a factual error about the other person. The mistake was intrinsic to the quality of your own internal commitment.
So true love summons the subject's entire resources and reorganizes their total being in the world.
Whereas illusory love, it only touches one specific persona, the traveler, the widower, the man of 40. The mistake is only revealed when you look back and discern the feeling's mistaken nature, which requires a knowledge of yourself that you only gain through the process of living.
The hysteria example is even sharper. A victim of hysteria genuinely experiences pain or paralysis. The person does not feign pain.
Right, but the pain is distinguishable from, say, real organic pain because at his core there is left a zone of tranquility. The feeling is genuinely experienced, but only on the outer fringes of ourselves. It's not fully integrated into the subject's entire existential project.
This highlights a really profound realization then. We cannot be transparent to ourselves.
And why not? Because we are fundamentally in a situation and surrounded. Our self-contact is necessarily achieved only in the sphere of ambiguity. We can't know ahead of time, with absolute certainty, everything we are later destined to learn about ourselves. The self is lived, not known, from start to finish.
So the ambiguity is structural. The lover is like the dreamer whose experience, say, the sexual content in a dream, is lived but not thematized or explicitly known.
Yes, it's the general atmosphere of the experience, and it lacks a background against which to stand out. If we were fully transparent to ourselves, we'd have no history, no surprises, no ability to learn about ourselves.
The whole concept of the unconscious would be meaningless.
It would be, because it implies a realm of the self not yet brought to light. The ambiguity is the price we pay for being an actively transcending, situated being, rather than a perfectly formed, self-observing object. We find ourselves only in the act, in the doing.
Okay, so if our internal emotional life isn't transparent, and if our external perceptions aren't immediately certain until we affirm them through a living act, how can we establish any logical certainty? We need a foundational architecture to replace the one from Descartes.
Well, we can actually extract two really robust argument chains from the sources that form the philosophical backbone of this whole critique.
Okay, let's do argument chain one, the solipsistic trap. This one formalizes the critique of absolute consciousness we were just talking about.
Right. So P1, if the Cogito reveals the self as a universal constituent of all being, the mind is necessarily unique and universal. That's the idealist premise.
Got it.
P2, a unique absolute self having no outside cannot be modified or recognize others. That's the consequence of that universality. C. Therefore, the plurality of consciousness is logically impossible if the self is absolute.
That's a clean dismantlement. The certainty of the idealist self guarantees its failure to explain the world we actually live in, a world full of other people.
Exactly. The philosophical search for the perfect absolute self ends up eliminating the social world, which, as we said, is a non-starter for phenomenology.
Okay, so what's the second one? Argument chain two, the priority of existence. This chain formally reintegrates thought into existence.
Yes. So P1. All thought of something is at the same time self-consciousness. This is the necessary link between a thought and the thinking subject.
Makes sense.
P2. Certainty of thought requires the certainty of the existence toward which it is projected. That's the indissoluble link we saw in perception.
Right.
P3. Existence is fundamentally action, or doing. It's transcendence, that deep-seated momentum of my being, or ekstase.
And the conclusion.
C2. Therefore, the cogito means consciousness, the I think, is reintegrated into the transcending process of existence, the I am.
So this means the equation I think I am is true, but the direction of truth is inverted. It's not because I think I am certain of my existence.
It's the other way around. The certainty I enjoy concerning my thoughts stems from their genuine existence and action in the world. The I think is basically swallowed by the I am.
So the cogito is just the recognition of this fundamental lived fact. It's achieved only by taking a blind plunge into doing, into acting, willing, loving, doubting.
Their certainty derives from the act itself, not from some detached, retrospective, intellectual observation.
Now that we have the formal structure, we need the specialized toolkit. Merleau-Ponty uses a very specific set of technical terms to describe this non-Cartesian existence. I feel like understanding these is mandatory if you want to grasp his argument.
Absolutely. Let's go through them.
Okay, let's start with the central dynamism, ixtase.
So ixtase is the active momentum of transcendence. It literally means standing outside oneself in the world. It's the continuous thrust outward toward the objects and projects of the world.
And this is what defines consciousness, not as a fixed internal thing, but as a movement.
Exactly. Your consciousness is not in your head. It is out there with the thing you're focusing on.
Okay, next up is the unique relationship that links the implicit and the explicit. Fundering or founding.
Funderung. This is a tricky one. It's the two-way relationship between the primary, unreflective, foundation-like perception, the body, a fact, and the explicit, derived, form-like reason, reflection, thought.
So the unreflective fact is primary because the reflective thought is just its explicit form.
Right, but here's the twist.
Mm-hmm.
The foundation is only manifest through that explicit, determinate thought.
Can you give us an analogy for fundering? That's a bit abstract.
Sure. Think about a legal system. The founding documents say a constitution is the foundational text. That's the Funderung. It's primary.
Yeah.
However, the legal tradition, the Constitution's meaning and its power only become manifest and visible through the concrete court decisions and laws that are originated from it.
I see. So you can't have the explicit law without the foundation, but the foundation is only really experienced through the explicit law.
You got it.
Okay, moving on to the actual source of our self-grasping. The tacit cogito.
The tacit cogito is the unspoken, pre-philosophical, and pre-verbal self-grasping of existence. It's that silent, immediate, I belong to myself that precedes and underlies the spoken cogito, the abstract intellectual reflection.
So it's the immediate, lived certainty we have before we even put it into words.
Exactly.
And the mechanism underlying our spontaneous actions. I think it was operative intentionality.
Yes, fungerende Intentionalität. This is the non-positing structural intentionality. It's the spontaneous alignment between our body and the world that precedes all conscious knowledge.
Like a musician playing a scale.
Perfect example. Their fingers move correctly without them consciously positing the location of every single note. It's the implicit structural skill, the art, hidden in the depths of the human soul that makes explicit thought possible.
We introduced this briefly, but let's formalize the concept of temporality structure. Transition synthesis.
Transition synthesis. Instead of an intellectual synthesis that observes separate, static moments like A, then B, then C, the transition synthesis describes the dynamic flow where one moment issues necessarily from the other. It defines time as a continuous, self-confirming running off.
Got it. And the act of creating meaning. Sinebung.
Right. Sinebung is just sense-giving, the act of conferring meaning. While idealists believe all meaning originates solely from the conscious mind, centrifugally, Merleau-Ponty shows that this meaning must also be partially autochthonous.
Meaning it emerges from the world.
Yes, grounded in our embodied dealings with things. It's always a complex interaction. We confer meaning, but the world also suggests it to us.
And finally, the type of consciousness we usually attribute to philosophy, the philotic consciousness.
The finite consciousness. This is the explicit, positing consciousness of an object. It's the derivative form of knowledge, where we abstract, judge, and affirm concepts like the cat is black.
And this is the type of thought that mistakenly believes it can grasp itself in total transparency, divorced from the lived body and the world.
Right. It's the result of reflection, not the foundation of existence.
That is a deep and powerful set of concepts. They function as the philosophical scaffolding for the second, and I'd say arguably most crucial, half of the argument, which is applying the situated self to time and freedom.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
And intensely abstract. If the self is defined by its continuous active presence in the world, that ixtase, then what does that fundamentally change about time? We often think of time as just this neutral container.
Right, and we have to discard that objective or flowing substance model of time. Merleau-Ponty's critique of objective time is just devastating. Time is not a flowing river pushed from the past to the future.
And why not?
Because that model requires a hidden external witness to observe the flow.
I see.
Objectively, outside of an observer, there are just successive instances of now. But these instances not being present to anybody, have no temporal character. They're just static. The objective world in its fullness is too much of a plenum for there to be time.
So past and future exist in the world only in an eternal state of pre-existence and survival, like water existing upstream or downstream. They're just locations, not time itself.
That's justly. And the attempt to internalize this, to say memory is just a psychological trace or a preserved image, that also fails. A preserved memory is just a present perception.
So a preserved fragment of the lived-through past, it continues to exist, it persists in the present, it can't open up the dimension of absence we call the past.
Unless we already carry the sense of the past within ourselves. The recognition of temporality precedes the mere reproduction of an image.
So if time is not a passive external thing, and it's not a collection of static, preserved internal images, it must be something the subject does.
Yes, time has to be in a process of self-production. It's never completely constituted. We experience time in the field of presence, the present moment, which always has these immediate horizons of past and future. The remote past is only accessible because it was once itself a presence that has been carried forward to this moment.
This is where we bring back Husserl's idea of retentions and pretensions. We aren't just gathering images of separate nows.
No, we are anchored to the environment by intentionalities that are structural. When a new moment arrives, the predecessor moment doesn't vanish. It's held, still present, but it's sinking away below the level of presence. This is a retention.
And the future is held as a pretension, an approaching horizon.
Exactly. So time is a network of these intentionalities, a single continuous movement. The transition synthesis, the instant D pushing C into the past, doesn't suddenly bereave C of its being. The disintegration is the consequence of C's coming to its own maturity.
This brings us to the core identity. The subject is the total movement of temporalization. This is the philosophical crux, and the sources give us an incredibly dense paragraph to define it. We need to hit the brakes here and truly unpack this.
Yeah, this is the hard part.
I'll read the technical definition that ties the subject and time together. It says, time is the effecting of self by self. What exerts the effect is time as a thrust and a passing towards a future. What is affected is time as an unfolded series of presents. The affecting agent and affected recipient are one because the thrust of time is nothing but the transition from one present to another.
Whoa. Yeah, that sentence attempts to compress the entire nature of existential subjectivity into a single description of temporality.
Okay, if I'm hearing this right, the force that moves time, the affecting agent, is also the thing being moved, the affected recipient. That feels like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, philosophically speaking.
It is precisely that self-pulling, self-creating vitality that defines existence. Let's break it down in plain English. Subjectivity, the I am, is not a neutral container for time, but is identical with the action of time itself.
We are the action of becoming.
Yes. The affecting agent is the forward thrust of consciousness, the ekstase towards the future, the intention to move or act. The affected recipient is the result, the continuous series of presents that unfold as you live.
And they are one because the force driving you forward into the future is the force that simultaneously defines and establishes the past and the present you just lived.
You've got it. It's the sheer dynamism of existence creating its own duration. There's no external clock. The clock is the rhythm of your own self-production.
So his conclusion is radical. We must understand time as the subject and the subject as time.
Your interiority, your ipseity is that continuous unified explosion or dehiscence of the present towards a future.
The analogy of the fountain jet helps make this visceral.
It's a great analogy. Imagine a fountain jet that always maintains the exact same stable parabolic shape, even though the water making up that shape is constantly changing.
So the permanence of the shape isn't due to the water drops themselves.
No, it's due to the single, continuous, unified thrust or action propelling them upward. The individual water drops, the isolated nows, they change continually.
But the shape, the subjective structure remains because the jet is one continuous push, one action, and that action is self-confirmatory. The new wave takes over the function of the old.
Right. If there were any break, any airlock in the flow, the jet would disintegrate. That unified self-confirming thrust is subjectivity, a time which abides and does not merely flow or change.
Wow. So we are not in time. We are the vital movement of time merging with the cohesion of a life.
Yeah.
But if I am a historical structure, a bodily situation defined by this continuous movement, where is the space for freedom? Doesn't this deep structure feel, well, limiting?
This is exactly where Merleau-Ponty addresses the paradox of freedom. The initial idealist reflection leads to the idea of absolute freedom. If I am truly free, my freedom cannot be limited or attenuated. Once free, I am uninterruptedly free.
And in that view, motives don't cause my decision. My decision lends the motive its force.
Right. But the problem with absolute freedom, the paradox, is that if freedom is everywhere and always complete, it is also nowhere. If my choice is completely ex nihilo at every instant, then the choice I made a moment ago, say, to start this deep dive, is immediately canceled by the next instant's absolute freedom, unless I choose it again.
Absolute freedom is a void.
It's a total void. For freedom to matter, it requires something acquired at my disposal. A decision has to plunge into the future, and the subsequent instant, though not determined, must be required by it. If there are no situations that need completion, if every moment is a totally fresh start, we never experience freedom as a meaningful struggle or commitment.
So we have to acknowledge the constraints, like the famous example of the unclimbable rock face.
The rock face has no inherent meaning. It's just granite. It only acquires the attribute of being unclimbable through the human project of wanting to surmount it. Freedom brings into being the obstacles to freedom.
But Merleau-Ponty insists that the self that qualifies the rock as an obstacle is not some detached, abstract, a cosmic subject.
No, it's the natural embodied self. The mountain appears high to me. The natural self, even if my reflective mind tries to imagine it as small from the perspective of a distant star, there is an autochthonous significance to the world, grounded in our incarnate existence. The body, our immediate situation, carries intentions that are not dependent upon my express intellectual decisions.
This leads us to the critical concept of sedimentation and probability. Our habitual attitudes and repeated choices build what he calls a sedimentation of our life.
Exactly. Imagine you've built your entire emotional landscape on an inferiority complex for 20 years. That is a massive amount of psychological inertia or sedimentation.
And the idealist would say the free act could technically, instantaneously blow them sky high.
But Merleau-Ponty says that act is highly improbable. And this is where the rationalist dilemma, either the act is possible or it is not, fails. The inferiority complex is not a distant static fact. It's the atmosphere of my present.
So those 20 years of habit have built a massive psychological and emotional inertia. It's not that you can't choose differently.
It's that the physical and emotional cost of that choice makes it statistically and existentially unlikely. That cost is the sedimentation.
Generality and probability are therefore not statistical fictions that ignore the individual. They are phenomena necessary to a situated historical being. Our freedom doesn't destroy our situation.
It gears itself to it. We see this beautifully in the example of class consciousness and revolution. The idealist says that becoming a revolutionary is an ex nihilo, instantaneous decision of consciousness. Objective determinism says the act is merely an outcome of economic conditions.
And both views bypass the actual doing of existence.
They do. Merleau-Ponty argues that I exist as working class in the first place, not as a mental category, but as a mode of dealing with the world, a concrete way of relating to others and to labor.
So the revolutionary project isn't an unwarranted, instantaneous decision. It's prepared by a molecular process that matures through shared experience and social coexistence.
The significance of events is the concrete project of a future which is elaborated within social coexistence.
So freedom isn't the power to choose anything regardless of history. It is the power to take up and modify the existing structure. It is the initiative, the thrust forward, that is limited but never nullified by the body in history.
Yes, and consider the example of the tortured prisoner who refuses to give names. His freedom isn't the freedom of an unbuttressed consciousness just floating above his pain. It is sustained by deep commitments, the phantoms of his comrades, his commitment to a shared struggle, or the proudly willed solitude he has cultivated.
These are motivations that don't cancel freedom?
They ensure it does not go unbuttressed in being.
That leads us to the final deep structure definition of freedom. What is the ultimate takeaway here?
Freedom is a meeting of the inner and the outer. It shrinks, without ever disappearing, in direct proportion to the lessening of the tolerance allowed by the bodily and institutional data of our lives. We are not free in spite of motivations, but by means of them.
So our existence is a manner of existing, a style, which we are constantly called upon to assume and carry forward.
And the ultimate truth is that the self is not an idle and inaccessible subjectivity, but is identical with my presence in the world and to others. That is the definitive break from the isolated Cartesian mind.
We are true through and through and have all that we need to transcend ourselves by the mere fact of belonging to the world.
The goal is simply to see clearly what we already are: embodied, temporal, historical beings defined by our relationship to the world and to others.
What an intellectually demanding, yet ultimately I'd say liberating deep dive. The sources force us to stop thinking of ourselves as ghosts and machines and start thinking of ourselves as dynamic living processes.
It's a powerful shift.
So let's synthesize the core knowledge nuggets from Merleau-Ponty's radical Cogito for you, the learner.
First, the foundation of self-certainty is inverted. The Cogito isn't about pure thought. It's about active existence, I am, being primary. Consciousness is a thrust into the world ekstase, and the certainty of the thought is derived from the certainty of the action.
Second, throw out the idea of absolute inner certainty. We live our feelings before we explicitly know them, and we can be self-deceived because we are always in a situation and cannot be fully transparent to ourselves. That ambiguity is a structural feature of existence, not a flaw.
Third, your selfhood is time. Time is not external. Your subjectivity is the continuous self-affirming process of temporalization. Remember the fountain jet analogy? Actively linking the past as retention and the future as pretension in a single vital movement.
And fourth, freedom is fundamentally situated. It is not an absolute void, but a power of initiative that must take up and modify the existing structure, the sedimentation of our history, our body, and our social roles, in order to act meaningfully. Freedom is realized through commitment, not isolation.
And we saw how the certainty of thinking requires the certainty of existence, and how all truth is supported by a sedimentary history we never fully make explicit.
The sources noted that even mathematical truths, like the triangle theorem, endure not because they exist eternally in some Platonic realm, but because the real triangle has implanted within us the notion of a being, which is what it is.
So we'll leave you with this provocative thought. If the permanence of an idea or a truth relies not on eternity, but on the continual bodily historical reenactment of the specific gesture that first made it true, what labor, what continuous existential commitment is required by you, the situated self, to keep a truth, a moral law, or a principle of justice acquired and active in the world, rather than letting it dissolve into abstract, unembodied rhetoric?
A profound question, reminding us that knowledge, like existence, is a continuous act of transcendence. We will leave you with that thought for your own contemplation. Until next time, keep digging.